People ask me all the time, Nolan, why is Final Fantasy IX your favorite Final Fantasy game? I scoff and open my mouth to give a pretentious answer, and yet I don't have the words, because the actual reason Final Fantasy IX is my favorite Final Fantasy is because it was the first one I ever played. I know, very anticlimactic, but I'll try and at least explain why this game means a lot to me. It's not purely sentimentality fueling my love. Final Fantasy IX is a really good game, and even 16 years after its release, it's still fantastic. So before I start with my gushing, let me be a negative sourpuss. The first flaw is how jarring the characters look on the pre-rendered backgrounds. This flaw is not native to Final Fantasy IX, as many PS1 RPGs have this flaw. These games looked phenomenal during their time, so it was more than serviceable to an audience during that time frame. However, if somebody who's never played an RPG before and has been conditioned by modern graphical standards picks up a PS1 RPG, then I understand if they would be repelled by the graphics. Plenty of retro games turn me off because of how ugly they look. And the last flaw for me is how slow the battle system is. I didn't notice this when playing it when I was younger, but when YouTuber Dark Kefka discussed the sluggishness of battles starting, that's when I began to notice it. I kinda wish I never heard that complaint, because before that, I was living in blissful ignorance. Now I could never unsee it, and with games like Bravely Default, which have a fast-forward function for battles, Final Fantasy IX's cause is not helped very much. Random battles aren't particularly difficult, so they end up taking a much longer time than they actually should. And that's it for my complaints. Those are pretty much the only problems I have with the game. Sure, there are things I wish were better, but those aspects that I wish were better are already good, so I don't really feel that they're worth delving into. Earlier, I said that PS1 RPGs would be tough for a modern audience to play for the first time. Outdated graphics are a reason for that, but another reason is the translation of some of these games. The translation of text from Japanese to English is something that's vital for RPGs with novels worth of text and dialogue. If the translation is botched, it can seriously affect the player's immersion. Final Fantasies 7 and 8 have mistranslations and awkward animations that don't reflect what the characters are saying. Again, I didn't notice these when I was younger, but knowing what I do know about the English language now, some lines can come off as sketchy. Some characters have these jerky movements and odd mannerisms that reach into the uncanny valley a lot. This was a product of the late 90s, and game companies didn't value translations as much as graphics and gameplay. Console games were still getting used to the idea of a massive narrative, so it kind of makes sense that the translation is off. But thankfully, Final Fantasy IX came out in 2000, and it had a great translation. Animations actually matched what characters said, dialogue was believable, and mistranslations were pretty much almost gone. Like the font of an article or the editing of a video, the translation is only noticeable when it's bad. If you, the player, don't question the dialogue during a game that was translated to English from Japanese, then the translators did a good, although thankless, job. This part of game creation is critical, as a botched translation is jarring to the player and can lead to a disconnected feeling. Sometimes this feeling of discomfort inadvertently adds to a game. Silent Hill 2 is an example of a game that sets you on edge because of its odd and distant dialogue. However, for a large RPG which is dependent on its story, proper translation is imperative to an enjoyable experience. Thankfully, Final Fantasy IX and most RPGs after it had a great translation. Final Fantasy IX knows what it is, and it's very confident about that. This sounds like an odd point, but remember in Final Fantasy X how there's this really weird conflict between Tidus and Yuna over who the main character of the story is? That game really struggled to follow the tale of the protagonist at points. It wanted to be about a person's journey of acceptance, but it also wanted to be a save the world plot, you know? This lack of assuredness diminishes enjoyment of the game and shows that the developers weren't very confident in their product, or at least they were confused about it. Final Fantasy IX knew what it wanted to be, and it stuck with it. It was a story with multiple arcs, but it was ultimately a save the world plot. Everything the player does contributes to unifying the world and beating the bad guy. Not very complicated, but that's not really a bad thing. Final Fantasy IX had a very traditional fantasy setting and had characters who were engrossed in the Final Fantasy motif. Character draws were traditional, leveling was much simpler, and there were less cumbersome systems. Final Fantasy IX is so ingrained in pure, raw Final Fantasy that I believe it's a perfect amalgamation of the series. There are black and white mage costumes, Realms. They're a group of colorful characters with differing abilities, and it takes place in a vibrant world that becomes worse as the game goes on. It employed so many tropes of old Final Fantasy games that it acts as the perfect entryway into the series. This is a great game to start with and then move on to the other Final Fantasy games. Other games in the series like Final Fantasy 6 and 7 are more revered by its fans, and I understand why. However, they all have fairly complicated plots and systems that may be daunting to a newcomer in the series. I would even go as far to say that Final Fantasy 9 works great as a stepping stone into the fantasy genre as a whole. Although one can perceive Final Fantasy 9's tropes as bland and traditional, I believe that the old Final Fantasy conventions still have charm. FF9 is incredibly confident in itself, and it becomes a much more appealing game because of this. I know I harped on the visuals of old PS1 RPGs earlier, but Final Fantasy IX's locations are steeped in raw atmosphere. This is the ultimate game to play if you're having a rough day and need to get engrossed in a world. All of my troubles melt away when I play this game. Looking back on it, there isn't a lot of actual locations you visit in this game. There are only really a handful of towns and dungeons. However, each one of these has a ton of effort put into it to evoke a feeling from the player. This game takes a quality over quantity approach. The capitals of the world feel huge because they have large buildings, people walking around, and fitting music playing. Lime Bloom really does feel like the capital of a continent, and Treno fits that seedy slum aesthetic perfectly. I believe that the pre-rendered backgrounds add a lot to the immersion in environments. I know that these backgrounds are essentially just JPEGs, but by utilizing a static portrait as a background, the artist is able to have more control over an environment's aesthetic. There's a location early on called Evil Forest. Yes, that's the real name, but even with a name as generic as that, the environment design adds a ton of atmosphere to the area. There are plenty of story events that happen here, but it acts as the perfect contrast from the kidnapping of Princess Garnet and the escape from Alexandria Castle. When you go from an area that looks like this to an area that looks like this, then there's no way that the player is going to get bored. These two areas are completely different and are symbolic of a fall. Zidane falls from being a member of his crew, Garnet falls from aristocracy to a swamp-like forest, Steiner falls from being a knight's commander to just a grunt that nobody takes seriously, and Vivi falls from his comfortable ignorance to the knowledge of his purpose as a weapon. However, like most of the game's story, there are glimmers of hope. Although Evil Forest starts with a swampy aesthetic, it gets better when the player encounters this site, a beautiful spring with a Moogle that will save your game, a break and a respite for the player. Not only is this site gorgeous and memorable, but it's a place of peace. Now, not every location in the game accomplishes this. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm over-analyzing the game design, but suffice it to say, the beauty and atmosphere of these backgrounds hold up incredibly well, even 16 years after this game's release. Final Fantasy games, regardless of their varying quality, tend to have consistently strong music, and Final Fantasy IX is no exception. Although Final Fantasy X is probably my favorite soundtrack in the series, the music here is phenomenal. Also, like Final Fantasy X's soundtrack, it is both atmospheric and great on its own. Every tune has me humming it while I'm playing. There are also no ambient noises in the background, so the player is left to their own thoughts while playing. There's also no voice acting in this game, so each character sounds just like the player envisions. Anyways, I've gushed about the music before in this video here, so let's move on. Look, I won't act like the total package of Final Fantasy IX's story is flawless, because it isn't. In fact, the story takes a nosedive in the very last level, and arguably in the last half of the game, which is sad because it was very strong up until that point. I won't go into specifics for sake of spoilers, but anybody who's played the game knows what I'm talking about when it just gets way too confusing for no reason. However, the moment leading up to that nosedive is really great. The story balances simplicity and a complex narrative very well. It's always progressing, and unlike Final Fantasy XIII's story, it never feels the need to really take a detour anywhere. There's always a constant goal to be fighting for, so it makes the story involving. There are breaks, of course, but these breaks serve as time for reflection for the player. One of my favorite parts of the game is the beginning of Disc 3. Disc 2 escalates a world conflict so much and has so many story events that it's incredibly intense, so the thing that the player needs is a moment of respite, and the game is paced so well that it knows exactly when to deliver it. Disc 3 begins with everybody just moping around about their problems, and it just cuts to them having an individual story with everybody, and I think it's a very fantastic moment. It keeps the story going, but it knows when to take breaks to show character drama. The story is able to stay optimistic, but that's because it needs that for the emotional moments to hit. Big, sad, emotional scenes don't work if the player doesn't care about the characters. Final Fantasy IX very much makes you care about the characters as they grow and begin to understand their flaws and improve them. Freya's stoicism and reticence holds her back from communicating with others, but as she hangs with Zidane, her antisocial shell shatters. In fact, Zidane is what probably holds this story together the most. He's an incredibly important main character as he serves to help every other party member understand their problems and flaws. His easygoing nature allows for stuck-up party members to open up more and become stronger friends. He's the glue that holds this story together. It is why when moments where he gets sad hit hard. It's also equally touching when every party member is there to support him. Final Fantasy IX's story strengths come in its character relations and their growth. It was the first mainline Final Fantasy to include additional cutscenes which provide insight into party members' lives. For most of the game, you don't even have every party member together. They're often split up in special groups or they have other duties to attend to. This is what makes the unity between all of them on Disc 3 and onwards so strong. Even when the story can get weak at times, the character drama is always strong and unites everything together. I hope I could articulate why this game is one of my favorites ever. There's a lot of gushing, I understand that, but this is a very biased review. Just know that if you want to get into the Final Fantasy franchise, I highly recommend starting with this one. The version on Steam is really good. Thanks for watching, everyone. I have a lot more videos coming up. Please subscribe if you enjoyed, and have a great day.